Welcome to Global Green Consumers, our online video summit hosted by the U.S. Green Chamber of Commerce. My name is Michelle Thatcher, and I am the CEO and co-founder of the organization. It is a special opportunity to witness a powerful environmental leader, one who is not only upholding her family's legacy as a global ocean protector, but who is also creating their own path and inspiring others to look at communities and the freshwater resources that are also so vital to life. It is my honor to welcome Alexandra Cousteau, a National Geographic Emerging Explorer, filmmaker, and an internationally recognized expert on water issues. She is the founder of Blue Legacy International, where she has led expeditions on 6 continents and has produced over 100 award-winning short films. So welcome again, Alexandra, and I'd really like to ask you, what role do these global expeditions play in the field of conservation? Is it awareness, research, advocacy, or more?
Well, Michelle, for me, having grown up in a family that made films and told stories, and having been able to see firsthand the impact that those stories had on people. From the time I was 6 months old, I was going on expeditions with my family. I could swim before I could walk. My grandfather taught me to dive when I was 7. So I sometimes say I was brainwashed at birth to be part of the storytelling tradition that my grandfather started. And I think that today stories are more important than ever because we're seeing so much change around the world in disappearing ecosystems, vanishing forests, vanishing coastlines, vanishing coral reefs, vanishing species. The world that my grandfather first explored really no longer exists. And so if we are going to come together and truly understand the risks that we face, the opportunities for change, and all the benefits that change can offer us, I think storytelling through photography and film is possibly the best way to get those messages across, because we are a storytelling species. And that is how we have transferred knowledge and culture and history and identity through the thousands of years that we have been living in community. And I think that is true today. And today, we have technology to tell stories that we never had before. So when I was going on my first expedition that I had organized for myself and funded and planned and executed in 2009, when we did 100 days around the world, looking at all the different kinds of water issues that exist from the Middle East to Africa to Asia and here in the Americas, I was using technology that my grandfather could only have dreamed of when he started his explorations in the 1950s. And that was tremendously exciting because it gives an opportunity for everybody to write themselves into the story. We tell stories that are universal, that are about issues, about people, about situations that I think anybody can relate to. We all need water to survive. We all have connections to places that we knew as children, that we shared with family, that defined our communities, that shaped the land we live on. And so telling those stories, I think, resonates with most people. And that's what is so exciting. Even if, sometimes we're telling stories that are sadder than others. We covered the Deepwater Horizon oil spill after it happened. We looked at how the Colorado River no longer reaches the sea. We've told stories about conflict. We've told stories about food security as it relates to water. So all of these are big issues, but ultimately they impact people, they impact families, they impact communities. And so those are always the stories that we try to tell.
So speaking of impact, which one of those stories do you feel like had the most impact on you as a conservationist?
Oh, gosh. They're all powerful stories. They're all stories that taught me different facets, different aspects of some of these global challenges. But possibly one of the most powerful experiences I had in the field was when we were covering the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. That was something that everybody in the United States has heard about. Most people around the world have heard about it. But we had actually been to these communities in Alabama and Louisiana in 2009, looking at the dead zone, because that at the time seemed like the worst possible outcome, right? Every summer, because of runoff, agricultural runoff coming down the Mississippi River, a zone the size of New Jersey in the Gulf of Mexico would become a dead zone. That means there was no oxygen. So anything that couldn't swim out of that dead area would die. And so fishermen were reporting finding shrimp coming ashore onto the beach because they were suffocating, and they could just go and scoop them up. But there was tremendous fear and anxiety in these communities because the fisher folk in the Gulf of Mexico, these are people who have, don't see fishing just as a job. This is a way of life. This is something that they learned from their fathers and their grandfathers, that they go out doing with their families, that they want to pass on to their sons and daughters. And this is a philosophy of how you interact with the natural world, of how you gather food from the natural world, how you make a livelihood from this natural resource. And it is deeply cultural, it's deeply personal, and it's deeply important to these communities. And so losing all of that in 2010 after the oil spill was devastating in ways that I had never imagined possible, and much more devastating than the dead zone. It's sort of, we thought the dead zone was as bad as it could get, and then the oil spill happened, and we realized that it could get exponentially worse. And I think seeing how those communities had aged in the span of a year, with disease, with heartache, with anxiety, with depression, how all of those had come together to really fray the edges of these communities, and the loss of trust that they experience, the increase in, domestic violence or even suicide. It was heartbreaking for us because we had created ties to these communities and we cared deeply about them. We had told their story and it had become, in a way, our story. But it also made me realize to what extent we are all dependent on the natural world for our health and our happiness and our prosperity. And, we move forward so quickly as we exploit and we extract and we take. And I think increasingly I see the beginnings of some of those impacts that we saw in the South starting to happen in other communities as they lose access to those places that are so important for everything that they hold dear. And we haven't realized that yet. We still think that we have to choose between the economy and the environment, and we don't understand that our natural environment is the foundation, it's the bedrock for our health, happiness, and prosperity. It's the bedrock of our economy.
If you could give it advice on just that particular incident, on if I was a business or I'm a consumer, what advice would you have looking at what happened in the Gulf of Mexico? How can I take measures to help prevent something like that in the future? Not obviously, we're not working for BP, but what could I do as a business, or what could I do as a consumer?
I think as a business or as a consumer, as a citizen, simply, it's important to understand that everything we do has an impact. So that plays out in many, many different ways, you know, conserving energy at home, the kind of car you drive, how far away your food is grown, whether or not you choose to eat meat, whether or not you choose to support local farms that are organic, that are caring for the land, that are managing runoff, that are part of your community. Who you vote for and what kind of policies they want to put in place is tremendously important, especially today. I think it's undeniable that renewable energy and more sustainable ways of living are the way of the future. And so embracing the idea that by researching and innovating and developing new technologies and new ideas and new solutions is what is going to be the differentiating factor in the future for any business. Holding on to old ways that are polluting, that are contributing to the disintegration of our culture, of our way of life, is going to be tremendously damaging. And I think if we want prosperity, which we all do, we have to think in terms of finding sustainable ways of doing things that protect our communities. And our communities require clean air, clean water, forest. It requires a clean environment. We can't destroy our environment and expect to get rich. That's not possible.
So talking about those results and looking at what you're doing in the storytelling, through the process of your storytelling and your films, have you been able to provided sort of the feedback of some of the results that have come out of your storytelling and your filmmaking? Perhaps an advocacy or somebody made a significant change in their world, their lives, their community. Is there some result that you know that has come back to Blue Legacy International and said, you know, based upon this, we changed?
Well, one of the things that we wanted to do when we were on the road, and in 2010 we traveled 18,000 miles around the U.S., Canada, and Mexico telling these stories. And it was National Geographic's first ever interactive expedition. So the goal of what we were doing was to bring people along with us. We were there for 5 months on the road telling these stories, meeting extraordinary people, having revelations about different issues. And so we brought people along with us. We were producing short films from the field. We were publishing photography and blogs. And so that was sort of the filmmaking storytelling side. The other side, we wanted to, since we were going into the field fully funded, we wanted to put aside a certain number of days to be able to support small nonprofits, different waterkeeper groups and others while we were in the field. And so we reached out to at least a dozen different waterkeeper and nonprofit groups in the communities that we were going to be going through and said, look, we're going to be there for a day. We'll give you a day of our time. How can we help? And so I would give speeches. I would join them in inviting the community to go experience the waterway, or I would go out with the press and, I remember in the Neuse River, I went out with the waterkeeper and one of the local journalists, and we did a flyover of the pig farms to see the runoff that was going into the Neuse River and causing all of these fish kills that you could literally smell for miles around. It was pretty horrific. And we did a lot of fundraising. We were able to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars for these organizations. All of it went to local organizations because, as I said, we were fully funded. So we just wanted to be able to support and empower them. And then, of course, all of the footage we made available to them. So the final films that we produced were theirs to use, as well as any of the B-roll that we had, and photography. So, not everybody took us up on it, but when they did, we would put a package of content together for them to use, because I think, it's difficult, especially for small organizations that are struggling for funding and trying to put as many resources as they can into the work that they're doing. It's really difficult for them to also be able to put resources aside to get, blue chip quality footage to tell their stories. And so being able to give them that value was tens of thousands of dollars of value that we could add on top of the support that we were giving them just by being present and being supportive and raising their profile and making sure that their community was engaged. And so that was, I think, one of the most satisfying parts of that expedition for me. It was being able to really embed myself in these communities and learn about their struggles, learn about their hopes and their mission and their objectives, and be some small part of making them successful.
Well, having led a water conservation organization in the past, a smaller one, I absolutely applaud and can see the exponential value something like that would bring, not only the film footage, but the sort of the notoriety of you and your team coming to town and shedding light on those types of issues that every local community has. And it doesn't matter where you go in the world, as you've seen, they're everywhere. So I applaud that work and thank you. I hope you can do more of that.
Yeah, we're planning to.
Good. So I know that your grandfather, Jacques Cousteau, which so many of us grew up with and watched the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, which I just learned, I just learned was the most popular documentary series in history.
Yeah,
so even though we all know it in my age group and older, and we literally, it was so influential for me personally. So can you share just one of your favorite stories about him, whether you heard about it or maybe it was a personal experience?
Well, he was an extraordinary human. Flawed as we all are, but truly a Renaissance man. He wasn't just a filmmaker. He didn't become Jacques Cousteau until after World War II. And at a time when Europe was in shambles and, certainly France was in shambles. He'd been a captain in the French Navy. He'd been an intelligence officer. He'd been a spy. And all of these things that he had done that were mind-blowing even before he did all the rest. He sort of stood in the midst of the wreckage that was Europe at that time, and imagine these oceanographic campaigns that he wanted to do, and this ship that he had dreamed of with my grandmother Simone, and was able to get the ship and get the support and go off on these oceanographic campaigns. And at the beginning, he was not an environmentalist. He was an explorer. He had co-invented the regulator. He'd put the aqualung together. He had started testing it. He almost lost his life several times because they didn't know the right mixture of gases and the impact it would have on the human body. And so they made some mistakes. And fortunately, he survived those mistakes and went on to explore 70% of this planet and make films about it, because filmmaking had been a passion of his since he was a child. And so he first wanted to go explore and see what was there and go deeper and stay longer and kind of be able to see this extraordinary undersea world. And he wanted to make films about it. And then the more he did that, the more he saw the damage that was happening, and became, with my father Philippe, one of the most vocal and ardent protectors of the oceans, because they saw how rapidly they were declining. And today we've lost over half of our coral reefs. We've lost 90% of the big fish. There's major fisheries that are collapsing. So there's a lot that we need to do to bring our oceans back. And I do a lot of work as a senior advisor with Oceana, which is the largest nonprofit dedicated exclusively to marine conservation in the world. They have offices all over the world. And it's tremendously exciting for me to be able to work with them on this bold, ambitious vision of how we can save the oceans and bring them back to abundance. Restoring that abundance means that we can feed twice as many people in poor developing countries that would really depend on seafood for their livelihood and their nutrition and their survival. So I get to support them in different countries where they are working on these policies. And that's been a nice return to my roots for me after having spent so much time exploring freshwater. And honestly, I see freshwater and oceans as very much connected. You know, our oceans start in our backyards, they start in our mountains, they start in our headwaters. And we really understand how important that connection is when you see rivers like the Colorado that no longer reach the sea. And, you know, the freshwater that touches the ocean is very important for fisheries. So it's important for fishermen, it's important for communities, and it's important for the whole web of life in the ocean. And when the Colorado River stopped reaching the Sea of Cortez, those fisheries started to dry up, and those fishermen no longer had, a livelihood. And so it's another reminder that our natural environment is the bedrock of our health, our happiness, and our prosperity. And when we destroy it or when we lose it, we lose all of the other benefits and ecosystem services that they provide. And I think my grandfather understood that. And you know, I feel like he did, in spite of everything that he did, to warn us, to engage us, to help us understand how important it is that we protect our oceans. We have largely, in spite of all the good efforts of nonprofits and the UN and well-meaning governments, stood by and watched this happen, this degradation. And my hope is that, you know, we've gotten to the point now where we can bring it back. We can understand that if you're just being sustainability with a fraction of the resources that you had before, you're not going to restore anything. I think we need to start thinking about conservation of our natural environment in terms of restoring abundance, bringing back abundance in the oceans, bringing back abundance on land, bringing back abundance of forests, and abundance of clean water, and abundance of clean air. That abundance that we took for granted 200 years ago, 100 years ago, we can no longer take for granted today. But we still have time to restore it. And that's an important change in perception. Because right now we talk about sustainability in terms of maintaining, fishery stocks at 6% of historic levels. And we can sustain that for hundreds of years, or we can restore them to what they once were. And in doing so, restore the health, happiness, and prosperity of the communities that depend on that. And so no matter where I go, no matter what story I tell, no matter what community I spend time with, it always comes back to this. And that might be why it seems like I keep repeating myself. It's a lesson that I've learned over and over and over again. And not just in the United States, but around the world. And I think there is urgency, but there is a window of opportunity. And taking advantage of that window and taking action now means that our children and our children's children will have access to the same opportunities that we did. And what better reason could we possibly have to restore the abundance of our natural world than so that we can pass it on to them?
So passing on to that next generation, when we look at the Cousteau legacy, what advice can you give your children and the Cousteau's children if they want to carry on that particular legacy? What new advice would you give them to create that not sustainable community, but regenerative community to where we do have that abundance?
Restoring abundance, I think, needs engagement at every level. We need to look forward towards the new innovative solutions that are being developed. We need to examine our own lives and our own communities and try to implement sustainability solutions at every level. So whether we do a better job of recycling and managing our energy consumption in our home and getting a hybrid vehicle, there's all sorts of things. There's lists everywhere. You know, we all know what we can do. Or supporting initiatives like the city of Austin, you know, is doing amazing things to make that city more sustainable. There's what we eat, you know, for our oceans and restoring abundance in the oceans. We need to eat differently if we're eating seafood. We need to eat local seafood. We need to eat smaller seafood. You know, eating a tuna is like eating a panda. There's simply not enough of them for us to continue to eat them the way we do. Same with swordfish. You know, swordfish in the Mediterranean have declined by 60% in the past 20 years. So, you know, we need to eat smaller fish because they can reproduce faster, and smart fisheries policies can help us restore abundance in those populations before we can restore abundance in the larger fish. So there's ways that we can create change, and you know, I do all of these things because you know, I've been bathing in this environment and this industry and these ideas for so long. I do it all, but I don't feel like I've given anything up. I feel like I'm investing in the future I want my children to inhabit, and that actually feels good. It feels good to make different choices because I feel like I'm not contributing to the problem that they're going to be faced with. We need to solve it now. We can't pass it on to them.
What is your next epic project or expedition that you will be taking?
Well, you know, I've taken a couple years, not off, but I've slowed down for the past couple of years as I had children of my own, and I'm looking.
That's an epic project.
It is. It's very epic. It's transformative. So it's shifted how I see my own projects, and it makes it more difficult to imagine going on 5-month expeditions now. But I am looking at feature film on ocean issues. I'm looking at doing a series of expeditions. I've kind of come back to the oceans after being in freshwater for a while. So it feels in a way like I'm coming home, but with a better understanding of the interconnectivity of all of these things. And I look forward to telling new stories, hopeful stories, stories about solutions. I'm kind of going to take a hiatus from telling stories about the problems. And I think we need to tell more stories about solutions. So that's where I'm headed.
Well, that is certainly where we as the U.S. Green Chamber try to help promote. We talk about solutions. That's probably why so many of my questions were focused in on those solutions. But you do bring hope. Your message is of hope. And I think that we all need that to be able to move forward. So thank you so much, Alexandra, for being
here Michelle.
today.
It was a pleasure.
And thank you for continuing that Cousteau legacy, and really with that grace and that determination, and just like what you did today with your inspiration. So
no, thank you.
Thank you. And I'd really like to thank all of our experts who, just like Alexandra, lead by example and continue to share their words of wisdom so that we can all really tap into that knowledge and that inspiration and access that sustainable leader within each of us. So thank you.